Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Roz Wollmering from, she's going to talk about animal welfare volunteering, creature comfort or rough awakening. A leader in the for-purpose volunteering sector, Roz focuses on developing strategic outcomes in volunteer engagement, building collaborative partnerships and giving voice to all sentient beings. Her attributes include applying civic engagement values and volunteering principles, and importantly, the integrity, passion and influence necessary to assist build a connected global society. Roz's experience includes as the RSPCA Victoria's Volunteer Manager, Australian Red Cross's National Manager for Voluntary Service, an International Volunteer Manager with the Australian Volunteers International and the US Peace Corps. She currently volunteers with Women's March Melbourne and is the Member and Corporate Relations Manager at Volunteering Victoria. Welcome, Roz.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm a little bit worried after Katina because I got a few basic facts I'm going to be sharing with you. No, it was really good. Let me start by saying that everyone in my office sends their love to you. They think what you do is amazing and fantastic. They're so delighted that I'm able to come and share a little bit of time and talk to you about volunteering. So from our hearts and all the rescue animals that we love in our office, I really want to say, without you, the world could not be as good as a place as it is, and we thank you very much for that. So maybe just by starting, and if I know you've been sitting for a while, so please, I won't be offended if you want to stretch and move around a bit. I'd like to get just a little bit of a sense of the audience. How many of you today are from a local government, a municipality? Great, okay. How many from a community group, non-for-profit organization? Yep, okay. Any industry, corporate? No, a couple, yay. Don't be shy, yep, great. University, academic? Super, fantastic. Okay, I have to shout out to Joanne because I loved one of her questions. I thought I would ask it of you. Do you love your volunteers? I said, oh, okay, good, a few head shaking. How about the perception? Do you think your volunteers love you? Do you know? Okay, great, super. So Volunteering Victoria, we're the state peak for volunteering, blah, blah, blah. Our vision sounds pretty blah, blah, blah. But this is what we really are about. We love to talk about volunteering. We all volunteer. We think volunteers are amazing. We think they can also be very problematic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. I'm going to cover these are the main topics just to give you an overview. What's happening in volunteering in Australia? What are some of the trends you need to be thinking about longer term? And yes, there are some real barriers and challenges. How are we getting beyond them in our environments? I was really encouraged about the topic of community and really how it takes a whole community to keep our pets at home and safe and loved. And I really would like to explore that with you more. We'll talk a little bit about what specifically is happening from what we see and hear in Victoria and animal welfare volunteering. You're going to know that context a heaps better than we will, but we can tell you it from what we hear from our volunteers. And then we'll get into some of the practicalities around the 3 R's, recruitment, retention, and recognition, or rewarding, and lastly, some of the resources that are available to you. So here's some of the basic facts. This is probably coming from the General Social Survey, ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, 2014. Okay, in Australia, I mean, it's a small country population-wise, but about 31% of all Australians 15 years or older volunteer. That sounds pretty good, 31%. That's a decline from 2006 of about 6%. So what's happening? Are people getting too busy? Are they having other things to do in their lives? What's happening on the decline of volunteering in Australia? Which, by the way, is the same trend that we see in the UK, Canada, and the US. We don't think that that's necessarily bad news. We think that volunteering, the definition of volunteering is changing, and that there are many other ways of volunteering now that people are engaging with that may or may not, they themselves may or may not be claiming that they're volunteering. Some of that's online, some of it's informal, some of it is outside of an organizational context. So they're going peer-to-peer, not necessarily in a formal organization. And that's a big space that is opening up, we think, with a lot of potential. Let's keep going. We also know that there's been more and more studies recently on the impact of volunteering. So of course there is the economic impact. I mean, if you had to pay all those 51 million volunteers, it would be costing quite a bit of money. But it's much more than the economic return on investment. We're really talking about the social return on investment. First and foremost, if volunteers are out there helping, then obviously the clients, in your case, it's the animals that they're supporting, helping and assisting, are getting direct benefit. The volunteers themselves are getting a sense of purpose and commitment. They're getting fulfillment. They're participating in their communities. They're helping someone. Organizations surely are benefiting, and this is where we tend to get stuck. It's all about the organization achieving its mission and the benefits, which is important. But community, more and more, what we know from volunteering, spontaneous emergency volunteering showed us that communities that volunteer are more resilient. They're more sustainable. They have more social capital, as I call it. And that's the space, I feel, that for animal welfare volunteering needs to be explored much more deeply. I did want to talk about Dr. Liz O'Dyer, who she's from Flinders University. In 2014, she estimated the economic value of volunteering in Australia was $290 billion. That was more than the mining industry at that time when it was booming in Australia. So volunteers are pretty important to our communities. Just a quick review of the definition of volunteering. Time willingly given for the common good, not just for me, not just about myself, and without financial gain. So that's pretty much it. I willingly give my time. I'm not forced to. I put my hand up willingly. It's to help someone else, to help my community, and I'll do it, and you don't even have to pay me. So what's happening with some of the trends of how volunteering is changing? One of the first trends that we're very conscious of, which is really hard for programs, services, and organizations, is that there's a decline. What used to be the long-term, long-serving volunteer, regular hours, once a week, coming in for 4 to 6 hours, that's changing. More and more, it's episodic, in and out, pop in, pop out, short-term, maybe 30 minutes today, but maybe I could do 2.5 hours Thursday night, but then I won't be back for 3 weeks because I've got catching up with some friends that are in town. So it's really becoming much more challenging for organizations, particularly when you have a relationship-based service, as animal welfare is, and you have to provide a consistency of care. That's really hard, and that's something worthwhile spending time in your volunteer recruitment and selection to make sure you're upfront and really insistent about what those needs are. Episodic virtual volunteering. There's a lot of stuff online that can be very helpful to organizations and to help you assist you meet your mission. Some of you, I'm sure, are already doing that. It can be completely online, or it can be a blended mix. That is increasing. There are platforms. I think every other month in Australia we hear about another one that's in design stage, pilot stage, launching, pre-launching, and some of them are doing pretty good. Skilled volunteering, particularly from the corporate sector. Again, most of you will probably know that many companies, I think it's over 60% now, corporates in Australia offer 1 or 2 days of employee leave where they will pay for their employee to go and to engage in volunteering in the community. Now, I have to say in the States, the average is 5 days, 5 or 6. So we're a little bit behind. But that's a phenomenal amount of really purposeful, deeply committed people who live and work in the corporate world, but really, really do want to give back to their communities. There's a deep purpose there, I feel, that we haven't actualized yet in our communities. Pro bono volunteering. Sometimes it's not that they have a day or two, but they would do it in their off hours, in their leave, in their long-serve leave, mat leave, in between jobs. They will willingly give some very specialized skills if you can be clear about what you need and what you want. Volunteer management. How many of you have a dedicated volunteer coordinator or manager in your organization? Great. Fabulous. Yep. So the profession itself is more and more professionalized. There are many more management courses available. We do a lot of professional development training for leaders and managers of volunteers. There's a lot more policy, compliance, risk management, strategic planning, all the core business skills and human resources skills that are now being applied to that profession of volunteer management. Social media networks. If you are not working with your volunteers with smartphones, you probably need to. They live on their smartphones. They're not sitting in front of a laptop. They're not sitting in front of a desk waiting for that email to come in. So if you're not connecting and communicating and engaging through mobile technology, it's something we encourage you to really look at. Have any of you had to deal with police checks and working with children checks in Australia? Yep. Sometimes we now are seeing in large organizations a dedicated person completely just to do the screening compliance checks now required by law. So it is becoming, that's one of the really distasteful things, and volunteers will be the first to walk away from huge amounts of bureaucracy. But we are seeing with the commission reports from the abuse of children in organizations and institutions that it's simply a fact of life. Every time a volunteer walks into another community center, they're going to hit with, we need a police check and we need a working with children's check. And they'll say, I just did it down the road. I just did it 3 months ago. Oh no, you have to do it again. So volunteers get really sick and tired of that, and we are seeing some dropout and frustration. So it takes time, I guess, to communicate and explore with them and to be understanding and empathetic that I really know you're going to hate when you hear what I'm going to say next, but I really have to ask you to take this police check one more time. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening with volunteers. They themselves are changing. We've talked about the diversity of volunteering, multicultural volunteering. Do communities own animals or do individuals? That's an interesting cultural context. What about the different abilities? We know in animal welfare volunteering often is people with very different abilities who will come particularly to work with you and the work you do because they do believe that animals won't discriminate. What they look like, how they act, or how they behave. And that can be a real challenge. Aging population, some of those fabulous volunteers who do show up week after week for years and years are aging and won't be with us in 10 years. And that's going to create, I think, a great loss to our communities, that demographic of volunteers becoming old themselves and very possibly in need of help and assistance. We're seeing lots of intergenerational identities becoming into play. This is often around the millennial mindset, expectations, their expectations for purpose, for engagement, for effective altruism. Like if I'm going to give you my time, I want to know that it's going to be used wisely, and I want to know that you are going to respect me, and I want to see the impact of what I am giving. So those are some of the millennial kind of mindsets. It's a big crowd, so I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I talked a little bit about the mobile savvy, just getting connected with volunteers from your iPhones. And I don't mean just millennials with this. More and more we're seeing the seniors get very much connected with iPhones, iPads, wanting that to be their main form of engagement with the company and your cause. And lastly, the increasing range of motivations and expectations. Some of the challenges that we hear organizations talk to us, most of you in the non-for-profit, and particularly government as well, are working in very under-resourced environments. There's rate capping, staffing, cost cutting, really challenging times to be mission-focused and keeping passion alive and keeping a very strong culture of volunteering. We are, however, seeing in Australia, certainly now, in 10 years ago, we would say that it definitely was not evident, but we are starting to see now dedicated volunteer strategy management roles for larger organizations, director of volunteers, volunteer development strategy officer. So some pretty high-level influential roles within organizations to really value and build a culture of volunteering and viewing volunteers as strategic assets. There's a lot of more technology, volunteer management systems now, being integrated with CRMs. Again, mobile technology. We're seeing more and more of the online platforms, connecting, communicating, volunteers joining groups together online because they're passionate about what they're doing. I think the challenge for organizations is, how do you? You could be working with a volunteer who's 18 up to 80 years old. How do you deal with the diversity of expectation, the diversity of what they're looking for, the diversity of their capability and capacity, and how do you do that when you're very thin yourself, thinly stretched? Another thing we like to talk about is, well, volunteers, we say we love volunteers, it's all very good, but we also know that there are some problem areas and negatives as well associated with volunteering. We do hear a lot about exploitation of volunteers, so it is important that you understand your rights and your responsibilities, both as a volunteer but also as an organization, in terms of legal and ethical responsibilities. We know also, just as vulnerable people can be exploited, so can vulnerable animals. And that was something we're very conscious of in doing our checks at RSPCA in Victoria, that it was important, and you couldn't say it enough, about the need to have clear guidelines, processes, policies for volunteers that are working with very vulnerable animals. And I think the consistency that you spoke about really rang true to me. It's very hard when a public member will come up to a staff person and then talk to a volunteer and get a different response. So it's those consistent policies take time to communicate. You'll find yourself communicating them over and over and over, because every day you've got 12 new volunteers who are going to show up, and they weren't here for the last 2 weeks, and they don't know what's changed. So it really is a struggle. I think what we are seeing a lot of also is that where do you as an organization stand on that continuum? Sorry. The continuum, I guess, from what we'd say the animal liberationists, up to the animal welfareists, up to animal rights. Where does your organization, you, sit on that continuum? And are you very open up front about that when you're volunteers, when you are going through your information sessions, when you're interviewing, when you're selecting or deselecting? Are you comfortable with the space that your organization in terms of mission is at? And do you understand where they are in their space also needs to have a discussion? I think another thing that's important to be aware of in volunteering is what we call that overcommitment and overpassionate response of the volunteer who gives and gives and gives and doesn't know that it's now becoming more negative to themselves and to the work they're doing by continuing to stay and volunteer. And that's a phenomenon that is very real and that we encourage to be very aware of in terms of supervision, self-care, and simply asking volunteers to step back when that's necessary. I thought I would just, I don't know if this is news to you or not, but this is just some recent, there's of the animal protection registered charities, there's about 220 in Australia, but there has been a recent significant increase in those protection charities. And you'll probably know that through the rescue groups that have been popping up, particularly every year, new ones created, and a spike in 2013. It's also pretty clear that it's the smaller charities that depend heavily on volunteers. So at Volunteering Victoria, we're there for the big ones like Australian Red Cross and Salvos and et cetera, but we're also there for those community organizations that have no paid staff, completely volunteer run, completely volunteer managed, and maybe, you know, have 10, 12, 15 years of experience on the ground. So those are the organizations that often are in need of the most support. This was just a little bit, it probably makes logical sense that most volunteers are working in organizations whose annual turnover is about 50 to 250K, because that's the majority of their resources are still at that level, are going to be volunteer-based. Whereas once you start getting up to $1 million or more, then obviously they're going to have more capacity to have paid staff. I think this is a context you will probably be much more aware of. And again, and many times I feel like I'm speaking as a public person when I'm in an environment like this, because you're the industry experts and you know your field sector certainly better than we do. But as a public person who reads the newspaper and who has lots of conversations in Victoria, we know that there's an increase in animal cruelty. We know that from RSPCA, their stats are online. There's been a lot of high-profile media stories the last couple years, about puppy farms, intensive breeding, greyhound racing, Oscar's Law. These are conversations that people have on the trams, have at home, have with their friends. And they care and feel very deeply, even though they may not understand or know the complexities that you in this room do. So I guess the questions I would ask for you, do you think community expectations are changing? Is the demand for rehoming increasing? Are rescue groups increasing in response? And are you leveraging that increased interest from the community to meet and expand your mission? I have to say, before I worked at RSPCA, I had no idea of the level of cruelty that animals do experience. And I think I'm probably not unusual in that. So let's talk a little bit about animal welfare volunteering. And again, this is pretty Australia-based. We know that interest in animal welfare volunteering exceeds the demand. We know this, Volunteering Australia and PwC did a report in 2016, and they analyzed demand and availability for volunteers, and animal welfare was one of the areas where volunteers most wanted to be involved, but there were the least number of opportunities for them to volunteer. We think, when asked about why weren't there opportunities, we feel that the lack of formalized, flexible, and innovative volunteering programs suggests that little thought has been given to how to use some of these new types of volunteering and how to really make them effective in your work and your organizations. And that raises the question, are we getting complacent? Are we not thinking creatively enough? Are we comfortable with the way it is? And if we are, is that boding well for the future and for the number of animals that do need care? I'd be interested, because this is, when we see the data, this is what we think, or what we think might be happening. I went to Go Volunteer, which is the Australian platform for all volunteer jobs, roles, and I just ran and think, all right, let's just see what types of roles are volunteers able to fulfill. And I think there was over 400. I just ran it about 2 weeks ago. And if I wanted to say, yep, I want to work in animal welfare, So I kind of separated out what I saw online, and there were the animal care roles, and then there were the non-animal care. And recognizing that a lot of people have different skill sets and different interests to be involved, and not all of them want to be directly with the animals. Many of them do, but there's other ways to engage. And foster care, I think, now is now being perceived as a great, way to really help with getting them back into home environments. And we're seeing certainly lots of increases in foster care opportunities being advertised much more publicly. That to me is quite a long list of different roles. Are there any that you are aware of that you work with in terms of your organizations? I'd be interested, because it seems like quite an exhaustive list, but perhaps there are others as well that you are working with. Can I ask how many of you are working, show of hands, with corporate volunteers or family volunteer, corporate? Okay, excellent. Family volunteering? Parent and child, guardian and child groups, or you'd offer an opportunity for a family to come and volunteer same time. Yeah, it's quite new in Australia, but yeah, and it does take some thinking to get it right, but that's an area. I'm really encouraged to see the corporate volunteering. I think the other thing that is really important that corporates do, I know because sometimes you think, oh, I'm going to have 14 people show up. I've got to put them through orientation. I've got them badge. I've got to tell them what they do, what they can't do. They're going to have so many questions, the same old questions, that every day. So why is it worth it? One of the animal care attendants said, Roz, it's not what they do, it's what they see and hear and what they take home. And that's the crux of it. Because if you can inform that person who then goes home, talks about it in their workplace, talks about it to their family, talks about it to their teacher, you can see the amount of impact that potentially that time that you gave that small group could have. They also turn into great sponsors, great fundraisers, and getting the message out. So if you are working with your corporates to really expand their role of how they can stay connected through sponsorship and fundraising, it can be quite a lucrative proposition. And certainly we're seeing those that, because animal welfare, that the opportunities are limited, they will only allow the corporates that they have an existing sponsorship or fundraising partnership. Those are the ones that get the opportunities to come in and have more engagement. These are some of the roles that skilled volunteers are doing. This is probably generic to any type of community-based program. The challenge of working with skilled volunteers is really scoping the role and being very clear about what you need and what you want, and taking the time to scope those roles with the volunteer up front. There's volunteers themselves, though, they do come with some barriers that obviously you do need to be thinking about that are quite different than employees. And some of them are, it's a matter of time. The greatest competition for volunteers aren't the other organizations, it's simply time. It's how much time do they have and can they give readily to you with all the other pressures of life from work, study, entertainment, family, etc. Most of them may be unable to make a long-term commitment. And that's a real barrier when you need that ongoing care. Yeah. They're looking for meaningful volunteering opportunities, fulfilling and meaningful. So I know that there are some organizations that tend to think that volunteers can just do the admin stuff, the stuff I don't like to do, the stuff I don't have time to do, well, just give it to volunteers. I think we're seeing that now volunteers can be quite choosy and quite demanding about what they're willing to do in terms of the fulfillment they want to receive in return. We talked a little bit about some of the barriers. Some of them, as soon as they hear that they've got to fill out forms or they have to do these checks, they'll walk out the door. And that might be a good thing as well. Health problems or physical ability, more and more the expectation is that you will work with them to try and find a reasonable role. That can be very challenging, but it's not impossible. Certainly we had a lot of people on the spectrum working at RSPCA, but it does take time, and it does take a commitment and a dedication. Language and cultural barriers. There's a financial cost. I think animal welfare, often because some of the care facilities are located outside of public transport routes, that can be a financial barrier for some people who are really willing and wanting to give. But just getting to where you are, if they don't have a car or don't have transport, can be a challenge. Lastly but not least, sometimes they just don't know that there's a need, and because no one asks them to volunteer. And if you are doing public information sessions around responsible pet ownership or desexing or how to take care of pets, some of the humane education, I would always be promoting what your needs are for volunteers as well, because often people just simply don't know that there are opportunities. No one has ever asked them. Let's see how we're doing. Cool. Organizational barriers, these are the challenging ones that organizations face. I think if I asked you, for those of you that work day to day with volunteers, how many of you could name 5 volunteers, first name only? Great, that's lovely. Yep. Sometimes I might get 1, 2. I don't know. Sometimes volunteers are kind of there but not seen. They're just sort of on the peripheral, and staff are so busy, and they just, can't remember one from the next. Sometimes they aren't. So I'm really pleased if you actually, your volunteers by first name. Good sign. Leadership, the role of the CEO. How often does your CEO or top executive have a volunteer focus group, volunteer recognition day, those types of things for setting the scene? Do they get together and talk to volunteers? Do they invite them into any of their strategy planning sessions? Those are the types of things that the CEO and top level of executive and governance can really communicate. Teamwork. Do any of you experience friction or conflict between your staff and volunteers? Yeah. Invariably, we hear it's really hard to get that relationship working well and working cohesively together. So we do a lot of work with supporting both sides to understand the other. So not surprising. And also, whilst volunteering is very much strongly linked to human resources and often in the same team, there are some very distinct differences between paid employees and volunteers, and understanding what those differences are can be really important to ensure that you're going to get the best maximum value from your volunteers. There are some that believe, kind of the old way of thinking is that just open the doors and volunteers will come in and they're free. Well, I think you probably know they do actually cost quite a bit. And they cost a lot of time, they cost a lot of support, they cost training, and they cost a lot of personal communication as well. And lastly, the fear that volunteers would take our jobs, but I think particularly in cost cutting or restructuring and government funding changing, that fear is still very strong in many organizations, helping to understand why volunteers are not there to take their job, how in fact staff can often increase their paid roles through the support of their volunteers is an important discussion to be having. I know when at RSPCA I used to cringe, because the one thing that really did upset me was every time a volunteer again questioned an adoption decision or a euthanasia decision, and sometimes all the way up to the CEO. After you gave them 8 hours of your 12-hour day, they just don't stop. And I think that can be really challenging for staff to continually be managing those types of very passionate individuals who are confronting or contesting organizational decisions. So very challenging spaces for staff to be working in. Do you survey your volunteers periodically? Like, so one thing that you might want to do is if you have employee surveys that your HR teams do regularly, see if they can also integrate or roll out a similar one for volunteers, because sometimes just asking volunteers for their opinion and giving them a place to voice and share that can take away some of that angst that is building up over time, and having focus sessions for them to kind of air their grievances in a safe space as opposed to some on-the-day job. I thought I'd get into some of the practical steps that might be helpful. There is a lot of information and resources online. I think I do want to recognize probably an old standard that's from the States, Betsy McFarland, who did the volunteer management for animal care organizations. I mean, that's probably 20 years old, but it's still very valuable. And I think it's online, and it's a great resource for any volunteer coordinator or manager who's working in animal welfare. There's lots of information available. Some of the things that I've heard, when I was supporting volunteers in an organization, is, oh, they're just so hard, it's easier to do it myself. And I understand that. Sometimes I absolutely feel the same way, but other times that can be a death wish for an organization if you're just looking at yourself as the only person who can get this job done now. And really trying to look to build that capability is really important. They estimate about initially, if you're working with a volunteer, you're going to have to give equal time. For every hour you expect, you're going to have to give an hour. But once that volunteer settles in, you would be looking at a ratio of for every hour, you're going to get 12 to 15 hours back, and sometimes many more hours than that. So as long as you can keep them with you, the better results you're going to get for the time you do need to give. I think if you're looking at recruiting, the first thing is before you open the doors, because we know the demand, if you open the doors, they're going to come in and they're going to say, hey, I can do everything and I can do anything and just get me going. So the first thing I'd say is really look internal and really, really question yourselves, why do we want volunteers? What do you want them to do? Get those job descriptions, make them attractive, make them compelling, be very purposeful and meaningful in those roles. Who will manage? Decide who's going to support and manage the volunteers. Please don't just add it on to your existing staff position descriptions. I can really feel for staff who are already overworked, and then they show up and they're told they've got 60 volunteers to support now going forward, and no one ever told me that when I applied. So it can really be a hard one to integrate into existing roles. I would be looking at some very clear risk management. I know that what we're seeing more and more once you get through the compliance checks is really about knowing the risk in terms of what types of volunteers can work with what animals and in what space. Are they good working with the public? Are they good working in adoption? Would they be better being a foster care? Should they only be working with animals who are ready to be rehomed? Or do they actually have some skills and capabilities to be working more with your animal attendants and taking on some of the higher level, more complex, risky opportunities? And lastly, understanding volunteer rights and responsibilities. Once you kind of have that sense of your skills and where they're needed, it's really looking at your pool that's out there, who they potentially are, what their interests and motivations, the barriers to getting them to volunteer, how will you reach them, and what are your key messages about your organization. And always remember that they're going to be looking for that purpose statement of what you do and why it's important, and why you want to compel them to give their time to you. Just a reminder, I don't think this would be, so most of you are probably done volunteering or have this inside. It's a very human nature, that sense of purpose and giving back, the opportunity to make a difference. These are the things that if you just state that's why you want their investment of time, they'll come on board because that's what they want to hear from you. They don't want to hear how hard it is. They don't want to hear how hard you work. They don't want to hear they just want to know that they can make a difference. And you have an opportunity, and it's very needed for them to be engaged. Some of the more university students are probably also looking at that experience base to help them on a pathway to employment, but we also see more mid-career people as well wanting to change careers, or that have a love for animals and want to experience something different. And also semi-retirement now is becoming a time when people are going down to part-time, but also looking to volunteer before they reach, full retirement. We're seeing some shifts of semi-retired people looking to do something very different from what they have been doing for the last 30 to 40 years. Again, attracting your volunteers. Word of mouth and networking is still pretty strong. Community talks and information sessions. If you have a neighborhood house, local government library, those are all the forums where word can get out really quickly. The Go Volunteer National Database is definitely one. It's free to use. It's where the national, any role for volunteers, that's a go-to point. Also some of the new digital platforms like Volley and virtual communiteer. Social media is being used more and more, if only to get the word out that you need volunteers, or you need foster carers, or you need community educators, community ambassadors. There's also local volunteer support services in Australia. They're probably connected to your local council, and what they can do is help to align some of the need to the what's available as well. And then we have the state peaks and the national peak. So this is Go Volunteer, the national database. Have you used it before? Most of you probably. Cool, great. And you can filter down by postcode. Potential volunteers really like to go on there and get a feel for what's out there, because they can search on what area of interest. They can search how far from where they live, 10, 50K, 5K. They can get a good sense of what's out there that they may be interested in. This is from the Volunteering Victoria website, so you can just punch in your postcode and it'll pop up where the closest volunteer support services are. And these are small organizations dedicated to helping volunteers and organizations that use volunteers. Probably not, I don't think there'll be any surprises about how to retain volunteers and how you can make more dedicated volunteers. I would say that, for volunteers, it is really important that they're given feedback directly, openly, as soon as possible, and not letting them continue to fester and grow, and also letting them have their say is important as well. Rewarding volunteers. Even though volunteers will probably always say, no, I do it for something, you don't have to say thank you. It doesn't take much, and it can have a big, big difference. A simple thank you to a volunteer can go a long way. I think telling the story of why the work that they do is important and the impact they're having is really rewarding. Most organizations nowadays, it's pretty good practice to have some type of volunteer award. Some are doing it every month. There's a volunteer award. It's a very small, it's a recognition. You can put in, staff can put in a nomination, and they're given a small memento, small award. The lunch and learn sessions, best way to orientate and train. Coffee time, quick catch up with your volunteers for the day about what's changing, what they need to know. And some of the national days of celebration, National Volunteer Week, which is always in May. It's the same week that the budget comes down, so it doesn't tend to get a lot of attention. International Volunteer Managers Day, which is November 5th, and International Volunteer Day, December 5th, coming up. The one thing, if your organization is already doing a lot in volunteering, I suspect most of them are, have a look at the national standards. They were revised in 2015. That's a good best practice standard for Australia in terms of volunteer programs. And you can really do your own internal audits to see how you rank. There's 8 national standards and criteria. So you can get a sense of doing your own internal organizational audit. It's in the papers for the conference as well. So you can download them, they're free. These are the state peak bodies. So any of those in your state are a go-to if you have any questions. We are on the phone constantly with common issues and challenges and what to do and how do I do and where do I go. So don't hesitate to call us. That's why we are here. And I encourage any of you, particularly if you're from a local government area. We do a lot with local government in terms of emergency management volunteers and community services volunteers, aged care, disability, etc. But we're still trying to get traction for animal welfare volunteering through local governments. It's just something we haven't been able to strongly advocate enough the need for, and I would really encourage you in Victoria to come and talk to us, because we feel that there's a great need being unmet with animal welfare volunteers through the local councils. And lastly, thank you. Thank you for listening to, I hope I didn't sound too preachy, but I do want to say thank you for all the work you do for the animals that we love, and I hope that your experiences with volunteers will be as rewarding for you as for the volunteers. Thank you.
I'll invite all our speakers up to answer some questions. Sorry, just inviting our speakers up to answer questions. So if we have any questions, if you can make your way to the microphone. And did anyone here start their career in animal welfare as a volunteer? Who started as a volunteer? Yep. Did anyone have a bad experience as a volunteer? Couple of people? Yep. Okay. So I think we have a question over here.
Hi, Roz. My name's Kerry. What's your opinion on asking volunteers to pay for their own police check or induction, blue card, etc.?
Yeah, I was hoping that question wouldn't come up. As a peak body, we do not advocate. We feel it is the responsibility of the organization to cover out-of-pocket expenses. That is absolutely the line we hold, and hold very strongly. However, we are aware, particularly in the States, we hear lots about volunteers being asked to pay for orientation packs, for T-shirts, because it costs to screen volunteers, because there are costs involved. And when I spoke to some organizations in the US, they said, well, no problems. Our volunteers are very willing to do that. You know, they will pay $30 for an orientation pack, so the organization doesn't have to. I kind of feel like, well, that's the way we're going to go, but I personally still have very, very strong reservations about taking that approach, because not every good person volunteer out there can afford it, and you might end up being in a very privileged, offering privileged opportunity, so I would discourage it from that. And fundamentally, from an ethical perspective, you're getting so much from a volunteer. If you can't afford $30, I'm sorry. The return from social volunteering is so much more than a $30 yeah.
Can I just help answer some of your question as well? If you're a registered charity, and I believe you have to be a registered charity organisation, if you contact your police department, then you can actually get a discount for volunteer registration, which is $5.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you for, yep. And working with children's checks doesn't cost the volunteer, but you still have, they still have to get photos, they still have to get to, have it signed to the post office. There's a bit of involvement.